So continuing on with our look at the Chronicles of Narnia, working backwards through the books, today we're going to be looking at Prince Caspian. Prince Caspian was one of the books in the series that, as a child, I wasn't as interested in. The storyline and the structure of the story didn't capture my attention as much as some of the other books did. As I read through it recently, I was able to take a more analytical look at it, understand, kind of the structure of the book, and identify maybe some of the elements that, reasons that I didn't care for it as a child. And one thing I noticed was that the pace of the book is fluctuates. Well, maybe I shouldn't say fluctuates, but it maintains a good solid pace through most of the book to begin with, and then at the end of the book, it kind of peters out, or it changes pace. I guess I should say, it changes pace in a way that it kind of throws the story or the feel of the book off a little bit at the end of the book. So I wanted to explain a little bit about what we see as the pace of the story, and then as in other videos, I want to also look at just some of the elements of the story, references, passages in the book that I found interesting. So as far as pacing goes, one thing I see as you are reading through the story is a nice solid pace. It's not too fast, not too slow. There's a development of the action of what's going on in the story. We have the Pevensies coming back to Narnia, and then finding Cair Paravel, and then meet up with Trumpkin. Trumpkin relays his own story, which is in itself like a sub story within the book as a whole. It takes place for several chapters, but it doesn't really throw off the pace of the story, I think, because the elements that Trumpkin brings in kind of fill in the backstory of what's going on for the plot of the story. From there, they leave Cair Paravel with Trumpkin. They sail down the coast a little bit and then up the river, and again the pace continues along at a nice steady rate. At the point in which they meet Aslan, however, I think that's where the pace changes, and maybe that's intentional on Lewis's part. We have Aslan, the chief role player in the whole series of the books. He is the Christ-like figure within the stories. He's the one around which all of the stories take place and are built. And so maybe it's intentional, that they meet Aslan, and the pace changes because Aslan is now on the scene. He's now taking control of different elements within the book, and being the underlying factor as to how everything plays out, through the rest of the book. One way that I see the change in pace when Aslan appears on the scene is, I jotted a few things down, that the party splits up at that point. Susan and Lucy head on off with Aslan, whereas the boys, Peter and Edmund and Trumpkin, they go off into a different scene. And so there's a separation of the parties that are involved. Up until this point, aside from Trumpkin's side story, up until this point they were all together. The action was happening all within what the group as a whole, the five of them, were doing. And now we have a split. When the pace changes, the first item we see is that the boys are going off to deal with what's happening in Aslan's house, and then Lucy and Susan, along with Aslan, go on off somewhere else. And at first, we don't know what they're doing, what the girls and Aslan are doing. Another element in the change of pace is that Peter says that they don't know what Aslan wants them to do. They're going to handle the situation the best way that they know how. Maybe assuming, what Aslan might want them to do in this situation. And in one way, it's different, because up until that point that they met up with Aslan, they were making decisions. Either Peter or Trumpkin, kind of the leaders of the party, were making the decisions as to what they should do. And we had a sense of, well, the group as a whole, they're on this journey, they're on this trek, from Cair Paravel to trying to get to Caspian's army, and we know what our objective is. It's to get to Caspian's army. But at the point when they meet Aslan, it kind of falls apart. I mean, yes, Aslan's in control, but they no longer know exactly what they should be doing. And then the last thing I wrote down is just the reliance on Aslan himself. And obviously, that's something, Aslan being the primary mover within the storyline, the source of ultimate good, they can rely on him. We can rely on Aslan to guide us along. However, it is a change of pace, because up to that point they were not doing that. They didn't have Aslan on the scene to do that. So it is a change in the way that they approach what actions have to take place within the book. Another element that I found interesting when Aslan does show up and the pace changes some is that up until that point there was tangible elements within the book. There were, let me see what I wrote down here. Descriptions of sunshine, the coolness within the woods, them being hungry, fire that they made, the storeroom at Cair Paravel, for example, different elements, tangible elements that were really brought forth in the book, because it really puts you into the kids, the Pevensey children, as they entered Narnia. They now had this. They were They were pulled out of England into Narnia. In England they were at the bus station. Now they're in Narnia. They're at the beach, the sunshine, the waves, maybe the hot air. I think it was described as being hot at one point. Very different from what they left at in the bus station, or I should say train station, I think it was. So as they journeyed along with Trumpkin to get to Caspian's army, those elements were brought forth. Those tangible things were brought forth. We had a feel for those, But once Aslan appears on the scene and the pace really quickens, I think that one interpretation of that change of pace is because we lose those tangible elements. There are a few. We can, I'm thinking maybe with the fight between Peter and Miraz, for example. There's some tangible elements that you read through in that scene. There's tangible elements when Aslan is taking the girls down through Baruna and freeing people. Get a sense of those. However, there's not enough within the pace of how the action unfolds that we maintain the same flow through the book. So I think those elements that came through earlier in the book really grounded the reader within that journey that the Pevensies and Trumpkin were taking, and we lose some of that sense as the party splits apart when Aslan appears. One thing I jotted down was that the last part of the book, because the party was splitting up, and there's different action happening, one action or some action with Aslan and the girls, and some action with the boys, and in other characters that show up on the scene, because up to this point we don't have a lot of characters involved. There are maybe Dr. Cornelius and Caspian in Trumpkin's story, and then maybe the soldiers that Trumpkin runs into. those are some minor characters that appear in the scene, and they have dedicated scenes that they're written into. But there's not a lot of outside action other than the Pevensey children and Trumpkin interacting and traveling through the woods in Narnia. So what I jotted down was just that, with the split up of the party, different action happening with Aslan and the girls, and then the boys, and then other people coming on the scene, other characters coming on the scene. For example, Mirez, his primary aides that he has with him, they have quite a lengthy conversation between themselves in the story. So it's another separate scene, within the book that's happening. And what I jotted down was that it's almost like there's multiple people trying to tell the same story at once. Up until this point, I keep going back to this, but up until this point, it was all one party, one scene. And nobody. Maybe Lucy did go off at one point, to interact with Aslan and the trees, but in reality, it's not like there's action happening at the same time. And that's what Lewis is trying to incorporate at the end of the book. And it gets almost to the point where there's too many storylines trying to be told, and you really lose the sense of what we had before, in the way the story was unfolding before. So a couple of the descriptions I found interesting, I want to look at that now. I think they feed into a little bit into the pace of the story as well. The first one is early on in the book. And you'll have to excuse the change in camera angle here. I'm trying out a new microphone, and the camera has to be a lot closer because of that. So when the children arrive in Narnia, and they find Cair Paravel, and they're there in the evening, and they've got the fire going, they find a chess piece. And let me start here. I'll read this part. Susan went to the well to get another drink. When she came back, she was carrying something in her hand. "Look," she said in a rather choking kind of voice. "I found it by the well." She handed it to Peter and sat down. The others thought she looked and sounded as if she might be going to cry. Edmund and Lucy eagerly bent forward to see what was in Peter's hand. A little bright thing that gleamed in the firelight. "Well, I'm jiggered," said Peter, and his voice also sounded queer. He handed it to the others. All now saw what it was. A little chess knight, ordinary in size, but extraordinarily heavy because it was made of pure gold, and the eyes in the horse's head were two tiny little rubies. Or rather, one was, for the other had been knocked out. "Why," said Lucy, "it's exactly like one of the golden chessmen we used to play with when we were kings and queens at Cair Paravel." "Cheer up, Sue," said Peter to his sister. "I can't help it," said Susan. "It brought back, such lovely times. I remember playing chess with the fauns and the good giants and the mer-people singing by the sea." So I'll stop there and explain that what I found interesting about the chess piece was that it's small. Imagine a chess piece. It's got to be small. And what I was thinking was that maybe the smallness of that element within the book kind of lends to the pace of the story. In order to identify something that small within the book, you have to be at a pace that you're not rushing through things. Here we are, the children are resting in the ruins of Cair Paravel. They're talking through, what they need to do, now that they're there in Narnia. And that little chess piece kind of slows things down because they're taking the time to look at it, hold it in their hands, examine it, notice that one of the eyes has been knocked out. So all of those little elements, really slow things down. If you're going to take time to study something and look at it, something small like that, it's not like you're examining something from a distance, and taking in the features. You're actually taking time to hold that and feel it. And you really need to have a slow pace of a story in order to do that. Another one similar to that one was, let's see, was in Trumpkin's sub-story, when he was explaining to the children his flight from, Caspian's flight from the castle of Miraz. There is a scene in which Caspian is getting ready to flee the castle. He gets on his horse, talks about Dr. Cornelius having provided some provisions for him already. And the provisions are put into a satchel, it says. And it says, let's see, Dr. Cornelius quickly cut up the remains of a cold chicken, some slices of venison, and put them with bread and an apple or so, and a little flask of good wine into the wallet, which he then gave to Caspian. Now, I could stop there, but the next sentence, I mean, we could stop there at the end of that paragraph and continue on, and you wouldn't notice anything different. However, Lewis writes in another sentence beyond that just adds a little bit more detail. Again, it's a tangible element. The visual and I think in this case it would be a visual. I'll read the sentence. It says, "It fitted on by a strap over Caspian's shoulder," the satchel, "fitted on by a strap over Caspian's shoulder, like a satchel you would use for taking books to school." So, again, that wouldn't be necessary to understand the whole flow of the story. If we really wanted the pace to continue to move on, why have that in there? But giving that description of that satchel, it just gives you another element or another visual that you can use to build the picture, to paint the picture of what's actually happening, to paint the picture of the specifics within the book. You can imagine having that satchel over your shoulder, or whether it was on Caspian's horse, I'm not sure. I suppose over the shoulder is what it was described as. But it's a picture, you can see that now in Caspian as he's riding away on his horse, him having that satchel on. It just builds that picture in your mind of what's going on, of just painting more detail into the book because of that. There's two more items I just want to look at. They don't really feed into the pace, I don't think, but they are items I found interesting in terms of the setting. The setting is the children having returned to Narnia. For them, after about a year, but in Narnian time, I think it's been calculated it's close to 1,000 years or more that have passed in Narnia. And if you really think about that, 1,000 years is a long time. We have Caspian the 10th that we're dealing with in the story. And that would indicate that there's been 9 Caspians before him, And you give the idea that, a generation, a man's lifetime as king, it might last 80 years, 60 years, whatever it might be. And you add those up over 10 times, So, even at the short end, we're dealing with 600 years. And that's still a long time as well. There's so much that can be forgotten within 600 years. There's so much that you wouldn't even imagine that the changes that could happen within history within 600 years. 600 years ago was the year 1400. So Columbus discovered America, 1492, we all know that. But what does that really mean? What was life really like 600 years ago? If you say in America, so different. I mean, America was the undiscovered country. The Native Americans were living here, so vastly different than what we see, what it's like now. Similarly, you could see the same for Narnia. I was also thinking in terms of my own heritage. I have no idea, who my relatives were 600 years ago. I know my grandparents, my great-grandparents perhaps, but beyond that, that's all I know. I haven't done any genealogical research, so I don't know. And even people who have they really gone back 600 years? That's a long ways to go back. I don't know if it's possible. But in terms of the men, or I guess I should say the kingly lineage within that's referenced in this book. I'm sure the lineage of Caspian. They've kept those records probably over time, and Caspian could probably tell you. What Caspian the third or fourth was doing or something like that, because they're more in tune with those things. But in terms of others, and I guess it's the people, or one person I want to look at, that brought this whole idea to mind, and that was the character of Lilygloves. Early on in the story as well. Here it is. So they were at Cair Paravel. They discovered the apple orchard, and the orchard was growing right next to the ruins. So initially they didn't realize this is Cair Paravel because they didn't plant an apple orchard next to right by the wall of the castle. But as they thought through it, they realized, oh well, if it's been so long, hundreds of years, the orchard easily could have crept in closer to the castle because the apples would drop and new trees would grow, and that would happen year after year, decade after decade, until it actually encroached upon the castle wall. And one thing that Peter mentions is, well, he's working through the points of coming to the conclusion that this is Cair Paravel. And he says, don't you remember it was the very day before the ambassadors came from the king of Calormen? Do you remember planting the orchard outside the north gate of Cair Paravel? The greatest of all the wood people, Pomona herself, came to put good spells on it. It was those very decent little chaps, the moles, who did the actual digging. Can you have forgotten that funny old Lilygloves? The chief mole, leaning on his spade and saying, believe me, your majesty, you'll be glad of these fruit trees one day. And by Jove, he was right. So here's Peter remembering Lilygloves, the mole. For Peter, it's been a year, that they exited Narnia back to England. And so he has but a year's memory, or a year's worth of time to go back in his memory and remember Lilygloves. Except, or I should say, however, for Lilygloves and his descendants, whoever they might be, the moles now living in Narnia, it's been 600 years. I can't remember, or I should say not remember, but I don't know my history 600 years back in my family. Similarly, I would doubt that the descendants of Lilygloves remember who he was 600 years ago. It's just, to me, it's a special thing that Peter can remember Lilygloves, who has been forgotten for hundreds and hundreds of years. He's dead and long gone, buried in the ground. Moles being diggers, they probably have these special, burials that they have, the Narnian moles. And he's dead and gone. Who knows where his grave is? And no one has remembered him or thought about him for centuries in Narnia. But here's Peter, hundreds and hundreds of years later, he remembers Lilygloves. And I think that's just a special thing because no one wants to be forgotten. Everyone will be someday. 600 years from now, no one will remember any of us, They won't remember our descendants, our children and our great-grandchildren. They won't remember any of them, because of how much time has passed. And yet, Lilygloves is being remembered by Peter, and it's just a special thing, I think, in the book. That's a good place to end. I think that's I think it's a representation of trying to write into the story the passage of time, because so long has passed. 10 Caspians have come and gone, or 9 Caspians have come and gone in the story, and who knows? Once once the Pevensies left Narnia, we don't know how long it was before Caspian the First showed up on the scene. So many years have come and gone, and yet there's a special way of writing in the memories of what has happened in the book, just in that little scene. There's quite a few other items that I had jotted down in terms of interesting things I had seen as I read through the book. A lot of just minor comments and references within the story. They didn't really play much into the pace of the story, as I was describing earlier, but there's still little elements that I found interesting. Maybe I'll come back and do another video on those elements, because they deserve some look at as well. I covered the pace of the story, which I wanted to do in this video, and then also looking at Lilygloves. I just, again, I really enjoyed that part. I found that was very a touching way to kind of bring someone back to memory. Thank you for watching.